Imagine standing in a city where the air doesn't smell like smoke anymore. It smells like iron and rotting meat. You're huddled in a basement, sharing a corner with a rat that's become your only friend, while the building above you is being pulverized into dust. You aren't fighting for a country or a flag anymore. You're fighting for a single brick wall. This wasn't just a battle. It was the moment the world's most terrifying war machine ran into a wall of human bodies and simply broke. It's called Stalingrad, and what happened in those ruins wasn't just war. It was a descent into something much darker that the history books are often too afraid to fully describe. Imagine a city that wasn't even a primary target becoming the graveyard of an entire empire. In 1942's war machine was unstoppable, slicing through Europe like a hot knife through butter. But then, he saw a name on a map, Stalingrad. It wasn't just an industrial hub on the Volga, it was the namesake of his ultimate rival, Joseph. Blinded by a toxic mix of hubris and personal hatred, diverted his elite 6th Army away from the vital Caucasian oil fields just to seize this symbolic prize. He wanted to humiliate on the world stage, but he didn't realize he was walking straight into a meat grinder designed by a man just as cold as he was. This wasn't a strategic move. It was a vanity project fueled by pure ego. Every soldier who stepped into that city was a pawn in a grudge match between two dictators who cared more about a name than the lives of a million men. Little did they know, the city was about to become a black hole that would swallow the German dream of global dominance forever. The nightmare began with fire. The Luftwaffe dropped enough incendiaries to turn the city into a jagged, skeletal wasteland in 48 hours. But this destruction backfired in the most horrific way possible. The rubble made it impossible for German tanks to move, forcing the world's most advanced army to fight a primitive, yard-by-yard struggle that the soldiers called the War of the Rats. Suddenly, the front line wasn't a map. It was the ceiling above your head or the sewer pipe beneath your boots. You'd be huddled in a basement, listening to the muffled boots of an enemy squad just inches away through a thin layer of pulverized brick. There were no rules, no mercy, and no escape. Soldiers used sharpened shovels and knives because guns were too loud and slow in the claustrophobic darkness of the ruins. The city had stopped being a place of buildings and streets. It had become a living, breathing monster that ate human beings for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, turning elite warriors into terrified scavengers. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the real horror began. The Soviets didn't just use bullets, they used the mind as a weapon. They set up massive loudspeakers across the ruins, blasting funereal music that echoed through the shattered factories. Every few minutes, a haunting voice would whisper in German. Every 7 seconds, a German soldier dies. Then they would play the rhythmic ticking of a clock. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Stalingrad is a mass grave. It was a psychological symphony designed to snap the sanity of men who hadn't slept in weeks. The Germans were trapped in a permanent state of hypervigilance, waiting for the ticking to stop. They called the Soviet rockets organs because of the terrifying whistling sound they made before turning a city block into a crater. It wasn't just about the casualties. It was about the fact that you could never feel safe. Even in the dead of night, the ruins were screaming at you, reminding you that your death was already scheduled by an invisible enemy. In the shadows of the grain elevators and tractor factories, a new kind of predator emerged, the Soviet sniper. This wasn't just warfare, it was a cult of the invisible killer. Men like became household names, turned into legends by a desperate Soviet propaganda machine. These snipers would crawl into the hollowed-out bellies of dead horses or hide inside chimneys for days, waiting for a single glimpse of a German officer's cap. The psychological toll on the German troops was catastrophic. You couldn't reach for a canteen or peek through a hole in a wall without a high-velocity round shattering your skull. The Germans felt like the very bricks were watching them. To counter this, they sent their own elite marksmen, leading to high-stakes duels in the ruins that felt more like a twisted game of hide-and-seek than a world war. Every pile of trash was a potential sniper's nest, and every open space was a death trap. The city was full of ghosts, and they were all armed with rifles and a grudge. There is a single apartment building in Stalingrad that became a symbol of the entire war's insanity. His house. For 2 months, a handful of Soviet soldiers led by Sergeant defended this nondescript pile of bricks against wave after wave of German infantry and tanks. The Germans mapped the city with precision, but they couldn't take this one house. It was a fortress of desperation. The defenders mined the approaches, set up machine gun nests in the cellar, and lived among the corpses of their comrades. Maps found on dead German officers later showed the building marked as a fortress, with the German 6th Army losing more men trying to take that one apartment block than they lost taking the entire city of Paris. It proved that in Stalingrad, the traditional rules of military science were dead. It didn't matter if you had the best equipment in the world if the man across from you was willing to die just to keep you from crossing a hallway. It was a house of horrors that the Germans simply could not break. While the Germans were obsessed with capturing every last bathroom and kitchen in the city center, they ignored the giant red flags on their flanks. Soviet Marshal was a man who played the long game. He noticed the German wings were held by Romanian and Hungarian troops who were short on anti-tank weapons and morale. On November 19, 1942, under the cover of a blinding snowstorm, the Soviets unleashed a massive pincer movement. They didn't hit the Germans where they were strong, they hit them where they were brittle. The speed of the Soviet armor was terrifying. Within just 4 days, the two arms of the Soviet offensive met at the town of, successfully encircling 250,000 Axis troops. Suddenly, the hunters were the ones in the cage. The cauldron, had been sealed. The 6th Army, the pride of the Wehrmacht, was now a giant, frozen island in a sea of Soviet red. The trap had snapped shut with a definitive, icy thud, and there was no way out. Back in Berlin, the leadership was living in a fantasy world. When General begged for a breakout, refused, blinded by his own propaganda. He turned to the head of the Luftwaffe, who promised that his planes could fly in 700 tons of supplies a day to keep the army fighting. It was a total, catastrophic lie. The reality was a pathetic trickle of supplies. Instead of ammunition and bread, planes would sometimes drop thousands of right-hand-only boots, or shipments of marjoram and pepper for kitchens that had no meat to cook. The air bridge was a highway of death. Soviet anti-aircraft fire and the brutal Russian winter shredded the transport planes. Soldiers on the ground watched the skis with desperation, only to see their hopes crash and burn in the snow. They were being abandoned by their own high command, left to starve in the ruins of a city they had already destroyed. The betrayal was complete. The men were being sacrificed for a lie that everyone in Berlin knew was impossible. As January arrived, the temperature plummeted to 40 degrees below zero. This wasn't just cold. It was a physical force that shattered metal and turned human skin into ice. The German soldiers were still wearing their summer-weight uniforms, a final testament to belief that the war would be over in weeks. Frostbite was more common than bullet wounds. Men would huddle together for warmth, only for half of them to never wake up. The hunger reached a level of depravity that history usually keeps hidden. After they ate the horses, they ate the dogs. After the dogs were gone, they boiled their leather belts and boots. And then the darkest rumors began to surface. Cases of the dark hunger cannibalism were whispered about in the bunkers. Men were found with human flesh in their pockets. They weren't soldiers anymore. They were hollow-eyed skeletons wandering a frozen graveyard. The civilized world had evaporated, leaving behind a primal struggle where the only goal was to live one more hour in the freezing dark. By the end of January, the end was inevitable. General was trapped in a basement under a department store, surrounded by filth and dying men. On January 30, sent a final telegram. He didn't send reinforcements or food, he sent a promotion. He made a field marshal. In German history, no field marshal had ever been taken alive. The message was loud and clear: kill yourself. Wanted a martyr for his propaganda machine. He wanted to take his own life to preserve the honor of the army. But a man who had seen 200,000 of his men die for a madman's ego finally found his backbone. He looked at the promotion and said, "I have no intention of shooting myself for this bohemian corporal." On February 2, 1943, he walked out of the ruins and surrendered. It was the ultimate middle finger to the Sixth Army was gone, and the myth of German invincibility had been buried under 6 feet of Russian snow and rubble. The surrender wasn't the end of the nightmare. It was just a new chapter of suffering. Over 91,000 German soldiers were marched into the frozen depths of the Soviet Union. They were sick, starving, and broken. Thousands died on the march before they even reached the camps. For the next decade, these men disappeared into the Soviet Gulag system, forced into hard labor to rebuild the very country they had tried to destroy. The statistics are chilling. Out of the 91,000 who surrendered at Stalingrad, only about 6,000 ever saw Germany again. The rest were consumed by the system, their graves unmarked and forgotten. Stalingrad wasn't just a battle, it was a warning. It showed the world what happens when total war meets total fanaticism. Today, the city is a peaceful place, but if you dig just a few inches into the soil, you will still find the bones and the rusted steel of a generation that was sacrificed for a name. The question remains, was it worth it?